Alviton Thomas was born on March 27, 1990, and lived in St. Louis, Missouri. At just 31 years old, she was a devoted mother of 5, known for her hard-working spirit, nurturing nature, and fierce love for her children. She had a passion for cooking and worked tirelessly to create a stable home, even while quietly enduring an abusive relationship with the father of her youngest child, Carl Mayberry. On the night of December 27, 2021, police were dispatched to Alviton's home on Oregon Avenue in St. Louis for a welfare check. What they found was horrific. Alviton was discovered dead sitting in a chair. A plastic bag had been taped tightly around her head, and she had been shot in the back. Her ear was severed, her forehead was severely swollen, and her hands showed clear signs of a struggle. Bleach had been poured over her body, likely in an attempt to destroy forensic evidence. Interestingly, there were no signs of forced entry. The violence of the scene pointed to someone who knew her. Detectives quickly turned their focus to Carl Mayberry, Alviton's boyfriend and the father of her youngest child. Her family told police about the history of abuse in the relationship. When questioned, Mayberry claimed he had been at work during the time of the murder. But co-workers told a different story. They said he disappeared from his job for several hours and returned in different clothes, visibly shaken. Text messages from Alviton's phone revealed she had been messaging with Mayberry shortly before her death, telling him she was at home and about to go to sleep. Investigators then searched Mayberry's phone and social media accounts, and what they found was chilling. Shortly after Alviton's murder, Mayberry had messaged someone with details about the crime scene, writing that she was found dead in the kitchen with a plastic bag wrapped around her head. This specific detail had not yet been made public. Around the same time, he was also searching online for first-degree murder defenses, and can he say she say be used against a person for murder in Missouri? He even texted a criminal defense attorney to ask how much it would cost to defend a murder. Despite the overwhelming evidence, charges against him were delayed. In May 2022, St. Louis homicide detectives requested a meeting with then-Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner's office to present the case, but their request was ignored. With no action taken, Mayberry ended up in federal custody on unrelated charges. The case then stalled until Mayberry's release from federal prison in 2025. This time, under new Circuit Attorney Gabe Gore, investigators finally gained traction. They secured a search warrant, and on May 7, 2025, nearly 4 years after Alviton's death, Carl Mayberry was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and unlawful possession of a firearm. At the time of his arrest, Mayberry, a convicted felon on federal probation for prior assault and firearm charges, was found with a loaded gun hidden inside his lunchbox. Mayberry made his initial court appearance on May 9, 2025, and remains in custody at the St. Louis City Justice Center without bond. For Alviton's family, the long-overdue arrest was bittersweet. It brought a measure of peace, but also reopened old wounds. They remember Alviton as a vibrant, loving mother whose life was stolen in an act of cold, calculated brutality. Now they continue to fight for her memory and for justice that should have come far sooner. Chelsea Alexandra King was born on July 1, 1992, and by the time she was 17, she was thriving in Poway, California. Chelsea was described as bright, driven, kind, and full of promise, the kind of person who left a lasting impression. She was a straight-A student with plans for college, had a deep love for music, and played with the San Diego Youth Symphony. She had her whole future ahead of her until a horrible tragedy occurred in early 2010. On the afternoon of February 25, 2010, Chelsea headed out for a jog at Rancho Bernardo Community Park, something she often did, but this time she never came back. When she didn't return home, her father went to the park to look for her. Upon arrival, he found her car parked near the trail with some of her personal items still inside. But there was no sign of Chelsea. A search began immediately. Days later, one of her items of clothing was recovered and DNA testing linked it to a local sex offender by the name of John Albert Gardner III. On March 2nd, Chelsea's body was discovered buried in a shallow grave near Lake Hodges. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Gardner, who was 30 at the time, had attacked her within an hour of her run, dragged her to a secluded area and committed the horrific crime before burying her body in the woods. 3 days after the murder, Gardner was arrested outside a restaurant in Escondido. The DNA evidence from Chelsea's clothing was the key that connected him to her murder, but the nightmare didn't end there. During questioning, Gardner confessed to another crime that had haunted the community for over a year. 14-year-old Amber Leon Dubose had disappeared on February 13, 2009, while walking to Escondido High School. She had been excited that day, carrying a check in her pocket to put down a deposit on a lamb she was planning to raise for the fair. She had already picked out the name, Nanette, a nod to her French heritage on her father's side. Sadly, Amber never made it to school that day. For 13 long months, her family searched and hoped. Then Gardner led police to her remains, found in a remote area near the Pala Indian Reservation. His only condition was that the information couldn't be used to charge him with her murder. Prosecutors had no choice but to agree, since they didn't have the evidence to convict him without his confession. It was a gut-wrenching decision, but one that brought some long-awaited answers to Amber's grieving family. Gardner's background was deeply troubling. He had been in psychiatric treatment since childhood and was first hospitalized at the age of 10. He claimed his father was a violent alcoholic, and school records listed him as seriously emotionally disturbed. After graduating from Rim of the World High School in Lake Arrowhead in 1997, he drifted between jobs and cities, eventually settling in San Diego. In 2000, Gardner was convicted for being sexually inappropriate with a 13-year-old neighbor and sentenced to 5 years in prison. After his release, he was placed on parole but repeatedly violated its terms, including living too close to a school, using drugs, and spending time in remote areas. At one point, he was tracked via GPS but still managed to avoid real consequences despite logging over 160 parole violations. That same GPS data would later show him near the very locations where Chelsea and Amber's remains were found. Even before Chelsea's murder, Gardner had attacked another woman. On December 27, 2009, just 2 months before Chelsea vanished, he attempted to sexually assault 22-year-old jogger Candice Moncio near the same park. She bravely fought him off, elbowing him in the face and breaking his nose, which likely saved her life. Her reports helped authorities later link Gardner to Chelsea's case. On April 16, 2010, Gardner pleaded guilty to the sexual assault and murders of both Chelsea King and Amber Dubois, and to the attempted sexual assault of Candice Moncio. In exchange for his guilty plea, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. On May 14th, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole, plus 25 years to life for the attempted rape and 24 more years for prior convictions. He also waived his right to appeal. Though nothing could undo the pain he caused, Chelsea and Amber's families turned their grief into action. Chelsea's parents, Britt and Kelly, fought hard for legislative change, and their efforts eventually paid off. In September 2010, Chelsea's law was passed in California, and mandates tougher penalties for violent sex offenders, including lifetime sentences after a first conviction and stricter monitoring through GPS. It also restricts offenders from entering public parks. To carry on Chelsea's legacy, her family founded the Chelsea's Light Foundation. The nonprofit awards scholarships through the Sunflower Scholarship Fund and host an annual 5K run called Finish Chelsea's Run. In 2014, the event raised more than $85,000. Portions of local roadways were also renamed to honor both girls. State Road 78 now includes the Amber Dubois Memorial Highway, while the bridge over Lake Hodges on Interstate 15 bears the name Chelsea King Memorial Bridge. Thankfully, this monster will spend the rest of his life behind bars, or he could never hurt another innocent soul again. Christina Marie Williams was born on May 1, 1985, in Okinawa Prefecture, Japan. Christina came from a military family. Her mother was Filipina and her father served in the U.S. Navy. Before moving to California, the Williams family had been stationed at Yokosuka Naval Base in Japan. Christina was adjusting to life in Seaside, California, and attending Fitch Middle School. On the evening of June 12, 1998, Christina took her dog, Greg, out for a walk in the Fort Ord neighborhood, a military housing area on the Monterey Peninsula. About 45 minutes later, Greg returned home alone, still trailing his leash. Christina, however, was nowhere to be found. After being reported missing, an enormous search effort got underway. The FBI quickly took over the case, and national attention poured in. Witnesses reported seeing a scared-looking girl in a car with two unidentified men, but nothing concrete came of it. Her disappearance gained nationwide attention, and even celebrities like Mariah Carey and Reggie Jackson made public pleas for information. Despite all the efforts, Christina's trail went cold until exactly 7 months later. In January 1999, a UC Santa Cruz botanist conducting a survey on the old Fort Ord base stumbled upon Christina's skeletal remains hidden under branches in a remote area just 3 miles from her home. The spot had been searched before, but nothing was found at the time. Her body was so decomposed that the cause of death could not be determined, but investigators knew they were looking at a homicide. By the early 2000s, attention had quietly shifted to a convicted sex offender named Charles Holifield. He was already on law enforcement's radar and had no alibi the night Christina vanished. He was also known to frequent the area where her remains were found. Holifield had a disturbing record. He had served time for multiple sex assaults and was known for targeting teenage girls. At one point, his then-girlfriend provided him with an alibi, claiming he was home with her the night Christina went missing. But years later, she recanted, telling authorities she had lied because she was terrified of him. She admitted he had threatened her and was physically abusive during their relationship. Despite this chilling revelation and circumstantial evidence pointing to Holifield, there still wasn't enough forensic proof to file charges until forensic technology advanced. In 2017, the breakthrough in the case finally came. Christina's underwear was retested by the California DOJ crime lab and DNA was found. The DNA profile matched Holifield exactly. He was already in prison at the time, serving 2 life sentences for sexually assaulting teenage girls in the early 80s and attempting to abduct another young woman at gunpoint. Rather than face a jury trial and the possibility of a death sentence, Holifield waived his right to a jury and was tried in a court trial. After hearing 10 days of testimony, including from his past victims, Judge Pamela Butler found him guilty of kidnapping, sexually assaulting, and murdering Christina. She sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This long-awaited conviction brought some measure of closure to Christina's grieving family. Her parents, Michael and Alice Williams, had held out hope for 7 agonizing months after her disappearance, and then spent nearly 20 more years praying for justice. Laura Arroyo was born on January 14, 1982 to parents Louis and Laura. At the age of 9, Laura was living in Otay Mesa, California with her parents and 2 older brothers when a horrible tragedy occurred. On the night of June 19, 1991, she was home in her pajamas, curled up watching TV with her mom in their upstairs apartment, when someone knocked on the front door. Around 9 to 10 p.m., Laura ran downstairs to answer it. Her dad, who had just finished bathing his 2 sons, remembered hearing her say, "Who is it?" But no response came. 10 minutes passed, and when she didn't come back, Louis went down to check and found the door wide open, but Laura was gone. At first, her family wasn't too alarmed. They thought maybe one of the kids she had been playing with earlier had come back for her. But when they went outside and started asking around, no one had seen her. That's when the panic set in. Louis spent the night driving around the neighborhood, calling her name, while his wife and sons waited in agony at home. Family and friends also stepped up and helped them create 300 flyers to hand out that night. Law enforcement wasn't immediately helpful, most likely because when Louis called for help, right after discovering his daughter was missing, he was placed on hold for 20 minutes. Police later said he likely called a non-emergency number by mistake, which may have caused the delay. Around 6:30 the next morning, 2 women found Laura's body on the sidewalk in a Chula Vista industrial area about 3.5 miles from her home. She was still wearing her pink pajamas. She had been stabbed multiple times and bludgeoned to death, possibly with a pickaxe, and there were signs she'd been strangled. At the time, police had no leads, no motive, and no witnesses. What made it more frightening was that just 2 weeks earlier, another 9-year-old boy who lived in the same apartment complex had nearly been abducted by 2 women. He thankfully managed to escape, but it raised fears that a crazed individual was on the loose in the area. Still, police weren't sure if the 2 incidents were connected. One early theory was that Laura might have known her killer. There were no signs of a struggle and she didn't scream, which suggested she may have opened the door to someone she trusted. But police couldn't be sure. 12 years later, in 2003, Laura's case was re-examined thanks to a newly formed cold case unit at the San Diego County District Attorney's Office. Technological advances in DNA testing revealed biological evidence that hadn't been detected during the original investigation. Samples taken from Laura's pajamas, mouth, neck, and fingernails were retested, and the DNA profile matched a man named Manuel Bracamontes, who had lived in a nearby unit until about a week before Laura was killed. Bracamontes had been a neighbor at the time, living with his girlfriend and their children. Several witnesses came forward, saying they'd seen him around the complex the night Laura disappeared. One child even remembered him saying something that lured Laura toward the door. When police tracked him down in 2003, Bracamontes tried to flee and led them on a high-speed chase before crashing his car. At that point, he was arrested and charged with Laura's kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA linked him to stains on Laura's clothing and to swabs collected during her autopsy. They found him guilty, and because of the brutality of the crime and the special circumstances, including kidnapping and sexual assault, they recommended the death penalty. In 2005, Bracamontes was formally sentenced to death. Years later, the California Supreme Court upheld both Bracamontes's conviction and his death sentence. And as of May 2025, Manuel Bracamontes remains on death row awaiting execution. Belle Burke was born on June 12, 1992 to parents Greg Burke and Deborah Drews. She was a kind, creative, and deeply intelligent 17-year-old who lived in Los Angeles. A student at Oakwood School in North Hollywood, Lily was passionate about writing, theater, and helping others. She was known for her warmth, sense of humor, and genuine compassion, someone who brought light to everyone around her. On the afternoon of July 24, 2009, Lily left her family's home in the Los Feliz neighborhood to run a quick errand for her mom, who worked as an attorney and adjunct professor at Southwestern Law School. Her task was simple: pick up some papers from the school's downtown campus. She arrived around 2:45 p.m., but at some point shortly after leaving the building, Lily crossed paths with a man named Charlie Samuel. Samuel, 50 years old at the time, was a parolee with a long and violent criminal record. That same day, he had been temporarily released from a residential drug treatment center under the pretense of going to the DMV, which was closed. Instead, he ended up in downtown Los Angeles, where he encountered Lily. The exact details of how he coerced or forced her into her own car are still unclear, but what followed was a terrifying ordeal. Over the next 2 hours, Samuel made Lily drive to several ATMs in an attempt to withdraw cash using her credit card. At some point, Lily called both her mother and father asking how to use the credit card to get cash. She didn't say anything to suggest she was in danger. She said she needed the money to buy shoes, and her father told her that the card couldn't be used at an ATM. He then suggested she come home, and Lily agreed. What her parents didn't know was that Lily was being held against her will, and that they would never see their daughter alive again. During that window of time, Lily did everything she could to survive. Police later said there were clear signs that she had fought back against her attacker. She suffered blunt force trauma and ultimately died from a slash wound to her neck. Samuel abandoned Lily's black Volvo around 5 p.m. in a downtown parking lot at 458 South Alameda Street, leaving her body in the passenger seat. He then walked just a few blocks away where he began drinking on Skid Row, a seedy part of downtown Los Angeles. LAPD-mounted officers detained him for public drinking and possession of a crack pipe, completely unaware of the crime he had just committed. Lily's parents reported her missing around 7 p.m. when she failed to return home. They tracked her phone and checked with their bank to confirm failed ATM transactions. Police treated the report seriously and began searching immediately. The next morning at 6:15 a.m., a downtown business employee noticed Lily's body inside her car and called 911. Detectives quickly began combing through the evidence. Fresh fingerprints were found on a soda can in her car, and they matched the man already in custody, Charlie Samuel. Surveillance footage showed him walking away from Lily's car and also appeared on ATM cameras with his arm tightly around her. Blood on the shirt Samuel was wearing during his arrest was confirmed to be Lily's. The following night, he was formally charged with her murder. Charlie Samuel's records stretched back decades. In 1986, he had kidnapped an elderly man, forced him to an ATM, and assaulted him when he couldn't withdraw money. That case and others should have added up to a third strike under California's three strikes law, which would have required a 25 years to life sentence. But a clerical error in his rap sheet misrepresented his prior convictions. As a result, when Samuel was convicted of burglary in 1997, prosecutors didn't realize it qualified as a third strike. He served his time and was eventually released. On May 27, 2010, Samuel stood in court, dressed in jail scrubs and shackled, and pleaded guilty to the kidnapping, robbery, and murder of Lily Burke. The plea deal allowed him to avoid the death penalty. He addressed Lily's family in court saying, "I'd like to deeply, truly apologize to the family for the grief I've caused them for the loss of their child. I pray to God that you may forgive me one day." Lily's parents, sitting quietly in the front row, issued a statement afterward, saying they were satisfied justice had been served and grateful that the criminal proceedings were over. They could now focus on keeping Lily's memory alive. The tragedy of Lily's murder stunned the city of Los Angeles and prompted public outcry over the flaws in the parole system. A simple bureaucratic mistake meant that a violent repeat offender was free to walk the streets. Thankfully, Samuel is behind bars for good and can never hurt another innocent person. Aaron Preston Rains was born on August 3, 1981 to Thomas and Barbara Rains. He was the youngest of 6 children, growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he was a 4th grade student known for his sweet nature, helpful attitude, and love of playing outside. He had a trusting and kind spirit which made what happened to him all the more heartbreaking. On the afternoon of May 11, 1992, when 10-year-old Aaron failed to return home from school, his family quickly grew concerned. After being reported missing, his body was sadly discovered in the basement of an abandoned building on West 8th Street in Lower Price Hill. He had been tied up, brutally beaten, and left in a horrifying condition. Police quickly zeroed in on and arrested 2 men by the names of Michael Bias and Daryl Gom, who admitted to luring Aaron into the building, under the pretense of paying him to help collect scrap metal. Once inside, they led him into the dark basement where they attempted to sexually assault him. Aaron resisted and the men responded with unrelenting violence, beating him with boards, a metal pipe, and a large rock until he was dead. Wounds on his head matched the pipe found nearby. He was then left tied up on the basement floor. Both men were convicted of murder, kidnapping, and attempted sexual assault and sentenced to death. But in the years that followed, their convictions were overturned after federal courts ruled they had not received fair trials. The Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals determined that both men were intellectually disabled, making them ineligible for execution, and cited numerous issues with the original trials, including withheld evidence and hearsay testimony. The rulings devastated Aaron's family and outraged many in the community. For more than 2 decades, Barbara Rains and her children continued to attend hearings determined to see justice for Aaron's murder. In 2015, after serving 23 years behind bars, Michael Bias accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, kidnapping, attempted sexual assault, and aggravated burglary. He was then sentenced to 35 years in prison. With credit for time served, he will likely be released around 2035. He will then serve 5 years of probation and be registered as a sex offender for 10 years following his release. The Lower Price Hill Community Council at the time of Aaron's murder had spent years warning the city that the abandoned buildings in the area were dangerous. After Aaron's death, the building where he was killed was torn down and a nearby lot became a memorial garden. More than 30 years later, the pain of Aaron's loss hasn't faded. He was a bright, loving child, with his whole life ahead of him. For those who knew him and those who have come to know his story, the ache remains, along with the belief that the justice system still owes Aaron and his family the accountability they deserve. As for Daryl Gum, he remains in prison serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Christy Giles was a 24-year-old model from Alabama with a bold, adventurous spirit and a growing passion for interior design. Her friend, Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola, was a 26-year-old architect from Mexico, a cum laude graduate who had just moved to Los Angeles to begin her dream job in design. The two women were building exciting new lives for themselves in the city when a single night out changed everything. On November 12, 2021, Christy and Hilda began their evening at an art exhibit in Soho House in West Hollywood. They later made their way to a warehouse party in East LA to see one of their favorite DJs. Photos and social media clips from that night captured them dancing in the VIP section, laughing and enjoying themselves. They were later seen with 42-year-old David Pierce, a self-proclaimed Hollywood producer, his roommate, 45-year-old actor Brant Osborne, and another man named Michael Onsbach. Around 5:30 a.m., Christy texted Hilda, "Let's go." Hilda responded, "I'll call an Uber 10 minutes away." But when the Uber arrived, neither of the women came out. The driver left after waiting a few minutes. That was the last message Christy ever sent. Later that day, Christy's husband, Saliers, noticed her location was now at the Southern California Hospital in Culver City. Alarmed, he reached out to Christy's parents in Alabama and to the friends who had gone out with the women earlier that night. However, no one could reach Christy or Hilda. Young left San Francisco and rushed back to LA, determined to find out what had happened. When hospital staff contacted Christy's parents, they delivered devastating news. Christy had been dropped off at the hospital by two men in masks, hats, and hoodies, driving a black Prius with no license plates. She was already dead when she arrived. Felt like she had been discarded like garbage. Her mother later said through tears. But even worse, no one knew where Hilda was. Using phone location data shared with Hilda's friend, Yoon and the friend realized that Hilda was still at the same unknown address in West LA where Christy's phone had earlier pinged. That address belonged to David Pierce. Later that same day, Hilda was found outside Kaiser Permanente West Los Angeles Medical Center unconscious and in critical condition. She had been dropped off roughly 90 minutes after Christy was. Hilda's family quickly flew in from Mexico, hoping for a miracle. Her parents sat by her bedside, devastated but holding on to hope. Tragically, after 11 days in a coma, Hilda passed away on November 24, 2021, just one day before her 27th birthday. Toxicology reports revealed both women had been given a deadly combination of drugs. Christy's system contained fentanyl, cocaine, ketamine, and GHB, the so-called date rape drug. Hilda's toxicology report showed cocaine, ecstasy, and fentanyl. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner ruled both deaths homicides caused by drug-facilitated overdoses. Jan Siliers refused to rest until he got answers. Using Christy's laptop, he accessed her text messages and pieced together the final hours of her life. He reached out to the event photographer from the warehouse party, who provided surveillance images showing Christy and Tilda leaving with Pierce and his friends. Other footage would later confirm that they were taken to Pierce's Beverly Hills apartment, an apartment that would become the site of a horrific betrayal. Investigators determined that within about 35 minutes of arriving at Pierce's apartment, Hilda tried to summon a rideshare to leave, but neither woman left. Nearly 11 hours later, Pierce was seen carrying Christy's lifeless body out of the apartment. An hour and a half later, he carried Hilda out as well. They were each dumped outside different hospitals. As police dug deeper, they uncovered an alarming history. Pierce had a long trail of sexual assault allegations going back to 2007. 7 women came forward with harrowing stories of drug-facilitated sexual and violent assaults and trauma at his hands. Their courage would help bring the case to court. On July 6, 2022, nearly 8 months after the deaths, Pierce was charged with 2 counts of murder and 7 counts of sexual assault involving 7 different victims. His roommate, Brent Osborne, was charged with 2 counts of accessory after the fact. Outside of court, Osborne insisted he was innocent and declined to comment further. At trial, the jury heard the stories of the 7 women who had survived Pierce's abuse. Their testimony, combined with forensic evidence, including Pierce's DNA found under Hilda's fingernails, painted a chilling picture of a man who had preyed on women for years. On February 4, 2025, justice finally called up to him. David Pierce was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Christy and Hilda. He was also convicted of 3 counts of forcible sexual assault, 1 count of sexual penetration by force, 1 count of sexual assault of an unconscious woman, 1 count of sodomy by force, and 1 count of sexual penetration by foreign object. Pierce faces 148 years to life in prison and will be required to register as a sex offender for life. His sentencing was scheduled for March 13, 2025, but postponed after Pierce fired his attorney and hired new legal representation. They now plan to file a motion for a new trial. If the motion is denied on June 30, 2025, the sentencing will take place afterward. As for Osborne, the jury couldn't reach a unanimous verdict and the judge declared a mistrial. A hearing is scheduled to determine if he will face a retrial. Meanwhile, he remains out on bond. In the wake of their losses, the families of Christy and Hilda have turned their grief into action. Christy's husband, Jan, scattered her ashes in their favorite places. Her parents held a memorial service in Alabama, surrounded by loved ones and memories. Hilda's family honored her life in Mexico, lighting candles and lanterns at her favorite park, playing her favorite music, and sharing her favorite cake. Also, her organs were donated, helping others live on. Their families continue to advocate for women's safety, encouraging everyone to share their locations with loved ones, trust their instincts, and never stop fighting for justice. Gabrielle Miranda Beechin, who went by Gabby, was born on February 27, 1994, in Morgantown, West Virginia. Gabby had just completed 6th grade at Bobtown Elementary School. She was bright, kind, and loved by everyone who knew her. She adored animals, especially her pet rabbit and her Saint Bernard, and had been part of the school chorus and spelling bee. Her future was full of promise, until a horrible tragedy occurred during the summer of 2006. On the morning of June 13th, 12-year-old Gabby left her home in Greensboro, Pennsylvania for what was supposed to be a short ride on her four-wheeler, something she often did. She always wore her helmet and was careful, usually visiting neighbors nearby. But that morning, she never came back. When Gabby didn't return, her mother grew concerned and called her father. Together, they searched the area around their rural trailer. But when there was no sign of her or her ATV, they called the police. What followed was a massive search effort involving local law enforcement, the FBI, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and volunteers from the community. On June 17th, 5 days after she vanished, searchers made a heartbreaking discovery. Her four-wheeler was found partially buried under manure on a nearby horse farm about 1.5 miles from her home. Investigators turned their attention to the farm's caretaker, 48-year-old Jeffrey Robert Martin. When questioned, he eventually led police to her body, which had been buried in a shallow grave not far from where the ATV was found. Cadaver dogs helped confirm the location early the next morning. Martin initially confessed to strangling Gabby after sexually assaulting her. He told police she had threatened to tell her parents and that he panicked. He said he used a backhoe to dig her grave and tried to hide the ATV. Later, he recanted and attempted to blame someone else for the murder. In May 2008, after a 6-day trial, a jury found Martin guilty of first-degree murder, sexual assault, aggravated indecent assault, and other charges. The next day, he was sentenced to death. His conviction and sentence were upheld by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in 2014, and he was placed on death row at SCI Phoenix, a state prison in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. In 2016, the Department of Corrections issued a notice of execution for Martin, but then Governor Tom Wolf declined to sign the death warrant. That's because Pennsylvania has had a moratorium on executions since 2015. A moratorium is a temporary halt, in this case, a decision by the governor to stop carrying out the death penalty, even though it remains legal. Death sentences can still be imposed by courts, but the state does not move forward with executions. However, Pennsylvania hasn't executed an inmate since 1999 and doesn't have plans to change that anytime soon. So while Jeffrey Robert Martin was sentenced to death, that sentence remains on hold. He is still alive and incarcerated with no current timeline for execution. But regardless of what happens legally, Gabby Beecham's memory lives on. Her light, her kindness, and her love for animals continue to be remembered by the people who loved her most. Camille Duntrees McKinney, who was known as Cupcake, was born on April 22, 2016 and lived in Birmingham, Alabama. At just 3 years old, she was full of life, bright, joyful, and loved by her family. But on the evening of October 12, 2019, that life was taken in an unthinkable act of cruelty. That night, Camille was attending an outdoor birthday party with her family in the Tom Brown Village public housing community off 41st Place North. Witnesses saw a man and woman in an SUV handing out candy to children. One child reported seeing Camille inside the SUV crying. She had sadly been lured away from the gathering and abducted. Surveillance footage later showed Patrick Devon Stallworth purchasing candy at a nearby store shortly before the abduction. His Toyota SUV seen in that footage was later impounded. The day after Camille vanished, investigators found disturbing images of inappropriate child material on Stallworth's phone, though none of the images were of Camille. He was initially released on a $500,000 bond, but taken back into custody shortly afterward. Derek Irisha Brown, Stallworth's girlfriend, was also arrested and held on a prior kidnapping charge involving her own children. A massive search effort unfolded over the following days, with the community and law enforcement working tirelessly. Tragically, 10 days after Camille disappeared, her remains were found in a Santec dumpster at a landfill near Warrior, Alabama, about 20 miles from Birmingham. The dumpster had been picked up from the Woodside condominiums near Stallworth's apartment. An autopsy revealed that Camille had methamphetamine and trazodone, a sedative, in her system. Prosecutors stated that the drugs were administered to make her sleepy and not merely present due to environmental exposure. Her cause of death was ultimately ruled as asphyxiation. According to investigators, Stallworth and Brown gave her the drugs, and Stallworth later accused Brown of placing her hand over Camille's nose and mouth, ultimately killing her. Evidence found in Stallworth's apartment included a plastic mattress cover with a blood stain containing DNA from Stallworth, Brown, and Camille. At a preliminary hearing, a judge ruled there was enough evidence to bind the case over to a grand jury. In December 2019, both Stallworth and Brown were indicted for capital murder of a child under 14 and capital murder during a kidnapping. Stallworth pleaded not guilty, while Brown entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. In July 2020, the pair were also indicted on federal charges of kidnapping and conspiracy, and were tried separately in federal court in late 2022. The juries in both cases found that the kidnapping directly led to Camille's death, which triggered a sentencing enhancement, mandating life in prison without the possibility of parole. In March 2023, both Stallworth and Brown were sentenced to life in prison. Stallworth showed no emotion and declined to speak at his sentencing. Brown, on the other hand, apologized to the court and Camille's family, stating that she would change the outcome if she could. However, April Thomas, Camille's mother, expressed her heartbreak through a statement read in court saying, "Life and death will never be enough for what you did." Although both Stallworth and Brown were already sentenced to life in prison without parole, the state of Alabama is still pursuing capital murder charges against them with the death penalty as a possible sentence. The delays are due to legal procedures and mental competency reviews, which must be resolved before the trials can move forward. In early 2024, Brown underwent several mental health evaluations, including an Atkins evaluation to determine if she's mentally fit to face the death penalty. She is currently committed to a mental health facility, and no new trial date has been set. We are now midway through 2025, and while their federal trial dates have not been set, at least they are in custody and can never hurt another innocent person again. Reynaldo Javier Rivera was born on September 13, 1963 in Madrid, Spain. He spent much of his early life in Europe before moving to the United States, eventually settling in the Augusta area, a region that stretches across Georgia and South Carolina. He served in the U.S. Navy, held steady jobs, and appeared to be a devoted husband and father. But behind that calm, respectable image was a violent predator. Between 1999 and 2000, Rivera terrorized the community. 5 young women were either killed or left forever changed by his actions. And as the investigation unfolded, it became clear this man had been hiding in plain sight. The nightmare began on June 29, 1999, when a 17-year-old girl in Augusta was abducted and sexually assaulted. Somehow she survived. Her courage in escaping and coming forward gave police the first thread that would later unravel Rivera's secret life. Then, on July 17, 1999, 17-year-old Melissa Faye Dingus disappeared in Graniteville, South Carolina, after an argument with her boyfriend. For more than a year, her family waited and hoped. That hope was destroyed in October 2000 when Rivera, already in custody, led investigators to her skeletal remains near I-20 in Georgia. A few months after Melissa vanished, another 17-year-old girl, Tiffany Sharice Wilson, went missing. She had left her North Augusta home to run errands with her infant daughter, Caitlin. Hours later, Caitlin was found abandoned in her car seat at a Georgia welcome center, her mother nowhere to be found. Weeks passed. Then, on December 30th, Tiffany's body was discovered in the woods. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death. Rivera would later admit to attacking her with her baby still inside his van. On June 19, 2000, Tabitha Lee Bosdale, also just 17, left for summer school and never arrived. Born in Augusta and known for her bright spirit, Tabitha was working as a telemarketer and attending high school. Months later, her remains were found and identified. Then came 21-year-old Army Sergeant Marnie Marie Glista. She was a dedicated soldier who had lived all over the world and was currently a military intelligence analyst stationed at Fort Gordon. On September 5, 2000, Marnie was viciously attacked in her own home. Her husband found her barely clinging to life. Sadly, she died 5 days later, and her murder became the focal point of the death penalty case against Rivera. But Rivera wasn't finished. On October 10, 2000, he lured 18-year-old Chrysalie Barton with the promise of a modeling opportunity. He then sexually assaulted her and stabbed her multiple times in the neck, nearly decapitating her. But thankfully Chrysalie survived. She somehow found the strength to describe her attacker in detail, leading to a composite sketch that would finally bring Rivera down. Just days later, he was discovered in a South Carolina motel room, having attempted suicide by slashing his wrist and overdosing on Tylenol. He survived, and so did the evidence. In custody, Rivera confessed in chilling detail. He described the murders of Melissa Dingus, Tiffany Wilson, Tabitha Bosdale, and Sergeant Glista. He even took police to their burial sites, and DNA and forensic evidence backed up every word. In 2004, he was tried for Marnie Glista's murder. The jury heard from survivors, saw his confessions, and reviewed his disturbing handwritten fantasies. They found him guilty and sentenced him to death, along with multiple life sentences. Rivera, now 61, has not been executed and remains on death row at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison. He has spent the last 2 decades filing appeal after appeal, claiming his confession was false, that his lawyers failed him, and even that he may be innocent in some of the murders he had once so clearly confessed to. In March 2025, a federal judge finally shut down those arguments. U.S. District Judge J. Randall Hall denied Rivera's request for an appeal, a writ of habeas corpus, and an evidentiary hearing. In his ruling, he rejected claims of prosecutor misconduct and ineffective counsel. Rivera's conviction and sentence still stand, yet even now he's asked for that ruling to be reconsidered. His legal team has even claimed that prosecutors hid a recorded interview taken just after his arrest, an interview they initially said didn't exist. The recording was later found in a former detective's apartment. But the court dismissed Rivera's argument, noting that he had confessed again and again, even requesting the death penalty in court and threatening to return years later with a better lawyer to escape justice. The courtroom was packed with victims' families. Kim Meek, Tiffany Wilson's aunt, was among them. She remembers how excited Tiffany had been that day, taking Caitlin to get her picture with Santa. The pain of Rivera's continued appeals has only added to their grief. He doesn't have the right to say he didn't kill her, she said, when he clearly confessed that he did. And what about Chrysalie Barton? She was only 18 when she was attacked, the woman who helped stop a serial killer, but no one ever really helped her. After surviving Rivera's brutal assault, Chrysalie never received the long-term support she desperately needed. No therapy, no trauma counseling. She was left to fend for herself. In 2011, at age 28, she was arrested in a drug sting, and the downward spiral didn't end there. On March 28, 2025, she was arrested again in Augusta for disorderly conduct. She struggled with the law, with addiction, and with loss. She lost 2 family members to overdoses. One was her brother Andy, and the other was her daughter who died in 2022. She spent years battling trauma, grief, and isolation, and yet without her, Rivera may never have been called. Dorothy Jean Finecourt, born Dorothy Jean Williams on August 24, 1917, in Hobart, Tasmania, lived a life that stretched across multiple continents, wars, and eras, only to end in mystery on a remote hillside in Northern California. For nearly 60 years, she was known only as Marion County Jane Doe, buried in an unmarked grave, her identity lost to time. However, thanks to advancements in DNA technology, in the relentless hope of her daughter, Dorothy's story has finally resurfaced. During World War II, Dorothy served as a nurse in Sydney, Australia. It was there in 1943 that she met and married Francis Arthur Vaillancourt, a U.S. Marine on R&R after fighting in Guadalcanal. Smitten with him and his dress whites, Dorothy followed her heart and in 1944 boarded the SS Lurline to begin a new life in America. They briefly lived in Massachusetts before settling in San Francisco, where they raised their growing family. Dorothy gave birth to 7 children, including twins Penelope and Pamela, and the family eventually moved into a Victorian home at 712 Steiner Street, one of the famous painted ladies of Alamo Square. Dorothy worked as a nurse at St. Joseph's Hospital near Buena Vista Park, and her husband found work as a painter. Life in the Vaillancourt household was, for a time, filled with joy. As for Dorothy herself, she was highly intelligent, spoke fluent French, and was very knowledgeable about plants. But life took a dark turn. On December 18, 1959, a severely beaten and sexually assaulted young woman, Susan Corlew, escaped her attacker and pounded on the Vaillancourt's door. Dorothy brought her in, wrapped her in a blanket, and called the police, ultimately saving her life. The trauma of that night seemed to mark a turning point. In the years that followed, Dorothy's marriage to Francis dissolved. She fell into alcoholism and struggled with her mental health. With Dorothy being unable to care for her children and their father working full-time, they were placed in Catholic-run orphanages. Penelope described their time in the Albertinum Orphan Asylum in Ukiah as abusive and traumatic. Eventually, the children were labeled incorrigible and transferred to another orphanage in San Francisco. During this period, Dorothy met and married a German immigrant named Hermann Hesse in 1964. According to Penelope, Hesse was a deeply disturbing man with a violent temper. He allegedly showed the children a photo of himself in a Nazi uniform, and records indicate he was born in 1911 in Germany. The family moved to a home in Fairfax, Marin County, but happiness eluded them. When Penelope was around 14, a violent altercation between Hess and the children erupted. Penelope said Hess punched her in the face and later tried to strangle her. Her brother threatened him with a gun, and police arrested Hess after witnessing the attack. The children returned to their father's care in San Francisco, and Dorothy remained with Hess. By late 1965, their home in Fairfax was ordered to be sold to pay off debts. Soon after, Dorothy vanished without a trace. On December 18, 1966, 15-year-old Arthur Muniz was hunting near Paradise Drive in Tiburon when he discovered a decomposing body about 25 feet down an embankment. The woman was dressed in a red cotton shift dress, a tan trench coat with blue plaid lining, and white slip-on shoes. A scarf was found in her coat pocket, a cigarette pack nearby, and she wore a Westclox wristwatch. Though badly decomposed, she was described as 5 feet 2 inches, around 105 pounds, with reddish-brown hair and full upper dentures. A wire suture near her eye suggested prior facial surgery. The coroner estimated she had been dead for 2 to 3 months, likely since late September 1966. Despite fingerprinting and a statewide bulletin, no identification was made. Some suspected she had been a psychiatric patient. Others thought she might have stayed in a local motel. Fireman Thomas Murphy came forward to say that a woman matching the Jane Doe's description had visited the Trestle Glen fire station in late September, asking to stay the night. When denied, she asked to borrow a car. She was last seen walking toward Tiburon Boulevard. Her cause of death was inconclusive, no broken bones, no clear signs of trauma, but she had clearly died alone. Speculation ranged from hypothermia to she took her own life to foul play. However, without answers, she was buried as a Jane Doe at Mount Tamalpa Cemetery in San Rafael. In 2022, the Marin County Sheriff's Office reopened the cold case with help from the California DOJ and Othram Inc., a forensic genealogy lab in Texas. Using ultrasensitive DNA testing and crowdfunding via Project Justice, author and scientists developed a comprehensive DNA profile of the unidentified woman and began tracing relatives. On December 18, 2024, exactly 58 years after the body was found, Penelope received the call. The Jane Doe from Tiburon was her mother. The discovery brought long-awaited closure but little comfort. She visited the site where her mother was found, now a serene spot in Paradise Beach Park. However, this left her with many questions. Was her mother killed? Did someone hit her with a car? Did she slip and fall? With no broken bones, some theorized Dorothy may have succumbed to hypothermia while sleeping outdoors. The presence of a scarf, despite it being early fall, suggests she may have been preparing for the cold. Temperatures at night in Tiburon during September could drop into the low 50s, and the area is known for its coastal winds. Others, including family, have questioned whether Herman Hesse played a role, though no evidence has confirmed this theory. Dorothy Valancourt was found dead on December 18, 1966, and as of April 2025, this case remains unsolved. Steve Bunch III was born in September 1968 to Alice Rawlinson Idlight and Earl Bunch Jr. Unfortunately, Earl Jr. was deployed to Thailand during the Vietnam War, leaving Alice alone in Sulphur, Louisiana with the baby. As time went on, her emotional distress worsened and she began writing disturbing letters to her husband overseas. These letters, which remained hidden for years until a custody dispute, revealed a harrowing account of a young mother struggling with motherhood, loneliness, and untreated mental illness. One of these letters, dated November 4, 1969, expressed Alice's intense hatred for her son, stating, quote, "I just got through whipping that little bastard. I hate him. That's the honest truth. I can't stand this life. God had to punish me by letting me have that little brat. I wish I would have died when he was born. I believe I could do it. I'm serious." Just a month later, on December 9, 1969, confessed her darkest thoughts, expressing a desire for her son's death, saying, quote, "I feel as if he would die tomorrow. Wouldn't care. To me, he is the one who ruined my life." Unquote. These letters further reveal Alice's growing obsession with her son and her desire to take his life before he became spoiled. These writings were kept by her husband who, at the time, dismissed them as cries for help or exaggerations caused by stress. He had tried to take an emergency military leave when he sensed something was amiss, but his request was denied. Then, on January 20, 1970, Earl Jr. received some devastating news. His son was dead. The story he was given was that Earl fell off a bed and sustained a fatal injury. However, the truth was far more sinister. On January 19, 1970, when Alice brought her son to the emergency room at West Calcasieu Cameron Hospital, he was described as limp and gasping for air. X-rays revealed multiple skull fractures and a broken shoulder. Moreover, there were visible bite marks, bruises, and a burn on his buttocks. A physician informed investigators that the injuries were inconsistent with a fall and suggested that they were the result of severe physical abuse, possibly involving being swung by the feet and slammed against a hard object. Tragically, the baby succumbed to his injuries the following morning during emergency surgery. Despite the compelling evidence, no charges were filed at the time. Alice's denial and the lack of pressure from anyone to pursue a deeper investigation led to the case being closed due to insufficient evidence. It wasn't until 1983, during a custody battle following Alice and Earl's separation, that the chilling letters resurfaced. Earl had been granted temporary custody of their surviving child, an 8-year-old daughter named Angela Michelle Bunch, when he decided to revisit the past. Rereading the long-forgotten letters from Alice, he realized their profound implications. Subsequently, he contacted the doctor who had treated their son and was horrified to learn the full extent of baby Earl's injuries. Earl attempted to gain full custody of his daughter, arguing that Alice was an unfit mother. However, at the time, psychologists and child protection standards were vastly different. Despite concerns raised during an interview with a daughter who now is believed to exhibited early signs of complex PTSD, the court ruled that both mother and child were mentally and physically healthy. Joint custody was awarded in 1985. Remarkably, Alice went on to lead a seemingly normal life. She became a nurse, reportedly working as a travel nurse, and in her later years, she traveled extensively to various places like Switzerland, Alaska, La Rotan, and Germany. Throughout her life, she evaded justice for the death of her firstborn son. In 2022, more than 50 years after the child's death, detectives with the Sulphur Police Department reopened the case at the urging of Earl's surviving family. Advancements in forensic science and child abuse investigations led authorities to exhume the body of Earl D. Bunch III. His remains were sent to the FBI for a forensic autopsy, which concluded that the toddler had indeed been murdered. The autopsy officially classified the manner of death as homicide. On March 27, 2025, Alice was arrested and charged with her son's murder. She is currently being held on a $950,000 bond. Edwin Lee Sinclair Daniels was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1982. In 1994, 12-year-old Edwin and his family moved to Florida. Growing up, Edwin found an outlet in technology and eventually turned his interest into a career, working for Verizon to support his family. At age 35, he was a devoted father, always there for his children. In 2002, he had a son with a woman he had dated, though their relationship ended after some time. Despite the split, Edwin maintained a strong relationship with his son, prioritizing his children above all else. In 2007, Edwin began a relationship with Latoya Woodard, a Florida native with a complicated past. Woodard had 3 sons from a previous marriage and had served in the U.S. Navy. However, she was accused of desertion and was discharged after she claimed she could not arrange childcare while serving. Their relationship seemed to progress quickly, and they eventually moved in together and had 2 daughters. After nearly a decade together, they married in 2016 and settled into a new home in Deltona, Florida, north of Orlando, with Woodard's friend, Crystal Leedy. Sadly, within 2 years, Edwin would be dead. On the night of April 13, 2018, Crystal called 911, reporting that Edwin had been stabbed. She said, "My roommate was stabbed. Think somebody might have broken in or something." Leedy said, clearly frantic, "He's not moving at all. I'm sorry, his wife's just flipping out right now." When officers arrived, they found that Edwin had been brutally stabbed multiple times and was pronounced dead at the scene. Woodard, in a state of distress, told detectives that she had been sleeping in the master bedroom when the attack occurred. She claimed that an intruder must have entered the home and killed Edwin. However, there were no signs of forced entry and the bed in the master bedroom appeared to be made, which did not support her story. Detectives also found no evidence of a robbery since nothing was missing from the house. As investigators began collecting evidence, they found several knives in the house, one of which was a cheese knife discovered in the kitchen sink. Woodard, still visibly upset, was taken to the hospital and later interviewed by detectives. She described her relationship with Edwin as normal, but admitted they fought at times, though they always reconciled afterward. On the day of the murder, Woodard claimed she had come home from work, asked Leedy to pick up the kids from school, and then went to bed only to be awoken by a loud noise later. She went downstairs and discovered Edwin injured. However, when Leedy was interviewed, her account did not match Woodard's. Leedy said Woodard didn't return home until approximately 7 p.m., and after that, Leedy went to Walmart. When she returned, she saw Woodard, who instructed her to call 911. Leedy claimed Woodard was too hysterical to provide any explanation. There was further confusion when detectives compared Leedy's statement to the 911 call, where she claimed to have heard a commotion before leaving for Walmart. Leedy admitted to investigators that when she left for Walmart, Edwin was at home and the couple was fighting. When she returned, she found Woodard crying over Edwin's body. Despite these inconsistencies, both Woodard and Leedy were released while detectives continued to investigate. Edwin's autopsy revealed the full extent of his injuries: 34 stab wounds, including wounds to his head, face, tongue, esophagus, and abdomen. He had suffered a depressed skull fracture, indicating the attack was both brutal and personal. The severity of the assault suggested that the killer was someone who knew Edwin well, and the weapon found at the scene, a cheese knife, was consistent with the wounds. Detectives learned that Woodard had been in a relationship with a man named Alan Roberson, a 26-year-old who worked with her at a fast food restaurant. Authorities found that Woodard had been texting Alan about a miscarriage, something she had not mentioned to Edwin. These messages revealed the depth of the relationship between Woodard and Alan, leading investigators to believe that it played a significant role in Edwin's death. Alan's employer reported that he had a meltdown at work on the day of the murder, and Woodard was seen visiting him that afternoon. When detectives tried to interview Alan, he refused to speak without a lawyer. Their investigation into his alibi revealed that he had been at home with his mother and sister. But the lengths he went to protect Woodard raised red flags. Authorities later subpoenaed Alan in September 2018, offering him immunity in exchange for his testimony against Woodard. However, his interview yielded no new information. His evasiveness only reinforced investigators' belief that he was protecting Woodard. Despite Alan's unwillingness to cooperate, investigators felt they had enough evidence to move forward with charges against Woodard. On November 15, 2018, Woodard was arrested. It was then revealed that Edwin had a $100,000 life insurance policy through his work, and Woodard had attempted to claim the payout shortly after his death. This added a financial motive to the already mounting evidence against her. On February 7, 2020, Woodard was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury deliberated for just under 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict. She was then sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on July 15, 2020. Now 37, Woodard is incarcerated at the Homestead Correctional Institution for Women, where she will remain for the rest of her life. Megan Nichols was born on July 18, 1998 in the small farming community of Fairfield, Illinois. At just 15 years old, she was known as an energetic and happy young lady who brought joy to those around her. Megan was a promising student at Fairfield High School, a dedicated cheerleader, and an athlete. However, everything changed on the evening of July 3, 2014, when Megan went missing. Megan's mother, Kathy Jo Hutchcraft, had planned to go shopping that evening, but Megan, who was feeling unwell, decided to stay home. When Kathy Jo returned about an hour later, Megan was strangely gone. In Megan's room, Kathy Jo found a note, which seemed to have been written by Megan, stating she had run away because, according to the note, she would never be happy at home. However, her mother felt these words were out of character for her daughter and immediately knew something was wrong. Megan's cell phone was also missing, and when it was later found, it had been wiped clean of all data, including photos, contacts, and messages. This was yet another sign that something sinister had happened. As Kathy Jo's worry grew, she noticed unusual activity in Megan's bank account. Surveillance footage from a local ATM showed Megan on her bike, withdrawing money just before her disappearance. What stood out to Kathy Jo was a car seen in the background of the video. That car turned out to be Brody Merbarger's car, who Megan had been secretly dating. Even though Kathy Jo had suspected it, Megan never confided in her about the relationship. Brody, 18 years old at the time, had been dating Megan during the summer of 2014. Although Kathy Jo had her suspicions about their relationship, she didn't know just how serious it had become. Kathy Jo had also found text messages between Megan and Brody suggesting their relationship had turned romantic. She had tried to intervene by confiscating Megan's phone, but Megan continued to stay in contact with Brody, and the two had even planned to run away together. Kathy Jo had witnessed firsthand how Merbarger manipulated her daughter. He showed up at their house after Kathy Jo forbade Megan from seeing him, telling her that she was too controlling and needed medication. When Kathy Jo responded by asserting her authority as a mother, Merbarger texted her, threatening to involve Child Protective Services. Kathy Jo refused to engage with him, but it was clear that Merbarger was becoming more manipulative and controlling. Even with that, authorities initially considered Megan's disappearance to be a runaway case. However, Kathy Jo and her family refused to believe this theory. Merbarger would become a prime suspect in 2016 when his car was involved in a crash. The FBI managed to track down the car, which had been sold to a salvage yard after the accident. Testing revealed a blood stain in the car's trunk that was confirmed to be Megan's blood, a discovery that left everyone, including Merbarger's best friend Kyle Ellis, who didn't believe Merbarger was involved in Megan's disappearance, shocked. In addition to the blood in his car, Merbarger also provided investigators with multiple inconsistent accounts of the night Megan disappeared. His story continued to shift with each new explanation raising more questions. Plus, his failure to provide a solid alibi only further deepened the suspicions surrounding him. Regardless of the blood, Megan was still nowhere to be found. 3 years later, in 2017, Megan's remains were found buried in a rural area in Wayne County, just outside their hometown. Her cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation, likely caused by homicidal violence. The case quickly shifted from a missing person investigation to a homicide investigation. Despite the evidence, he was not arrested immediately. The case took another turn when his best friend Kyle was brought into the investigation. In 2020, 2 FBI agents came to Kyle with alarming news. They had evidence suggesting Merbarger was involved in Megan's murder. They also proposed an unusual plan. They wanted Kyle to confront Merbarger and wear a wire during the conversation. After days of deliberation, Kyle agreed, understanding the gravity of the situation. Kyle had known Merbarger since high school, and their friendship had been a close one. The two had been valedictorians at Fairfield Community High School. Both smart, ambitious kids who wanted to escape the confines of their small-town life. The friendship he had with him was built on years of shared experiences and mutual respect. However, when Kyle learned of Megan's disappearance, his first reaction was to text Merbarger, not to get the details of what happened, but to offer advice, particularly urging him not to talk to anyone without a lawyer. Merbarger, however, repeatedly spoke with authorities, offering conflicting statements about his whereabouts and involvement in Megan's disappearance. Faced with mounting evidence, agreed to help the FBI. They instructed him to confront Merbarger while wearing a wire. On July 2, 2018, Kyle met with Merbarger and the conversation took a tense turn. Kyle asked Merbarger about the blood in his car, and his response was chilling, quote, "I would like to know that too," unquote. When Kyle asked him if he had killed Megan, Merbarger denied it, but his words seemed to hint at a deeper truth. He suggested he couldn't have been physically capable of strangling someone, but implied that someone with anger issues might have done it. Kyle described the exchange as a pin-drop moment. While Merbarger's statement didn't constitute a confession, it was the closest he came to one. The FBI had long suspected that Megan had been strangled in a fit of rage, and Kyle's recording helped solidify the case against Merbarger. 6 years passed before Merbarger was finally arrested and charged with first-degree murder in 2020. In the end, he was found guilty and sentenced to 50 years in prison. Shelley was born on July 25, 1969, and grew up in Arkansas. She later moved to Cairo, Texas, where she lived with her boyfriend Ronnie Hendrick and their 2 children, 12-year-old Kayla and 9-year-old Dustin. At 32, Pam, tired of her troubled relationship with Hendrick, finally decided to leave with the children and return to Arkansas. Unfortunately, her plans were cut short by the one person she was trying to get away from. On January 6, 2001, at 5:15 p.m., about 20 minutes before she was set to leave, a call came in to 911 reporting that Pam had shot herself in the bathroom of the home she shared with Hendrick. When the police arrived at the house, Pam was already in an ambulance on her way to the hospital, and Hendrick was with her, making him unavailable for immediate questioning. At the scene, police observed blood on the bathroom floor and walls, and a pistol was found on the counter. While the gunshot wound appeared consistent with a self-inflicted injury, investigators were suspicious. When they were finally able to question Hendrick, he reiterated that Pam had shot herself. According to his statement, he had been outside when he heard the gunshot, rushed inside, and found her on the bathroom floor, bleeding from the head. He also claimed that he shielded Kayla and Dustin from seeing their mother's body. Hendrick suggested that Pam had been depressed about returning to Arkansas due to family issues, particularly her strained relationship with him and Kayla. However, Pam had been moments away from leaving Hendrick, and it didn't make sense that she went through the trouble of packing up all their belongings only to turn around and shoot herself. Sadly, Pam was declared brain dead at the hospital, and after being taken off life support, they ruled she took her own life. The medical examiner's report supported Hendrick's version, noting a contact wound with the gun positioned at the side of Pam's head. However, Sheriff Carl Bowen, who had been part of the original investigation, was unconvinced. Bowen, familiar with Hendrick's abusive tendencies, found it hard to believe that Pam, a woman who was on the verge of escaping an abusive relationship, would take her own life. In the years following Pam's death, the case went cold, but Bowen, now a more senior member of the Dewitt County Sheriff's Office, could not let the case go. In 2008, he pushed to reopen the investigation, believing there was more to the story, especially in light of Hendrick's history of domestic abuse. Hendrick had agreed to take a polygraph test during the original investigation, but had missed several appointments, and eventually he went missing, further complicating the case. The breakthrough came in 2012 when Hendrick was incarcerated on charges of domestic abuse. Bowen seized the opportunity to re-interview Hendrick, but his story continued to change. On the day of the murder, Hendrick claimed he was outside when the shooting occurred, but during his re-interview, he admitted that he had been inside the house when Pam was shot. These inconsistencies only raised more questions. Bowen also learned that Hendrick had a history of abusive behavior with other women, and a particularly troubling detail emerged. Just days before Pam's death, Hendrick had severely beaten her, leaving her with visible bruises that required emergency room treatment. Further forensic analysis of the gun used in the shooting provided more unsettling findings. No DNA was found on the weapon. This suggested that the gun had been wiped clean, indicating a deliberate attempt to conceal evidence. This discovery prompted the medical examiner to change Pam's cause of death to undetermined, providing more ammunition for Bowen's theory that Pam's death was not self-inflicted. Bowen's investigation gained momentum when he spoke with Pam's former mother-in-law. She revealed that Pam had been in secret contact with her ex-husband Jesse Suggs using a burner phone. Pam had secretly planned to return to him, and during a phone conversation, Hendrick had threatened Jesse, saying the only way Pam was coming back to Arkansas was in a pine box. This statement provided investigators with a clear motive for murder: Hendrick's desire to prevent Pam from leaving him. With this new evidence, authorities took the case to a grand jury. In the fall of 2012, Hendrick was indicted for the murder of Pamela Shelley. After more than a decade, the case that had once seemed closed was now moving toward justice. In September 2013, Hendrick's trial was delayed due to a small jury pool, but just weeks before the trial, he pled guilty to the murder of Pamela Shelley and was sentenced to 22 years in prison. For Pamela's family, this was a long-awaited moment of justice. Thanks to the persistence of her daughter Kayla, Sheriff Bowen's unwavering commitment, and the support of the Cold Justice team, Pam's death was finally recognized for what it truly was: a tragic murder. 68-year-old Chung Mo-young was an avid hunter from Lansing, Michigan. Unfortunately, a hunting trip to Rose Lake State Park in Bath Township, Michigan would end in a horrible tragedy. On November 16, 2018, Chung set out for his usual hunting session between 3 and 4 p.m. that afternoon. However, when he failed to return home later that evening, his wife grew concerned. His family began searching, and it wasn't long before they found his vehicle. In the park's parking lot, following footprints in the snow, they made a heartbreaking discovery: Chung's lifeless body lying face down with a gunshot wound to his head. The shocking death stunned the Bath Township community, especially within Michigan's hunting circles. Investigators worked tirelessly to unravel the mystery surrounding Chung's killing, but the case went cold for several years. It wasn't until witness testimony, a critical piece of evidence, and the discovery of a plastic bag with hunting spray near the scene that investigators honed in on a suspect, 35-year-old Thomas Olson of Grand Blanc Township. Investigators determined that Olson killed Chung and stole his belongings, including his headlamp, knife, backpack, and shotgun. They were able to identify him using DNA found on the plastic bag. They also discovered text messages between him and his friend Robert Rodway that hinted at both of them being involved in the murder. One message included a photo of the two men in hunting gear at Rose Lake with the caption, "A couple of cold-blooded killers revisiting the crime scene," while another referred to a poster seeking tips about Chung's killing, saying "they haven't caught ya," later updated to us. The content of these messages, coupled with Olson's search for news about the death before authorities publicly released information, was quite damning. In December 2022, both men were arrested and charged with murder. However, in September 2023, Rodway's charges were dropped due to issues with evidence admissibility. In February 2025, Olson was found guilty of second-degree murder and felony firearm possession. He was then sentenced to 22.5 to 60 years in prison, with an additional 2 years for the firearm possession. For the Young family and many others in the hunting community, the conviction brought a sense of closure, though the pain of their loss would never truly fade. Danita Monique Smith was born on November 20, 1981 to Sharon Cook and Calvin Smith. A native of Charlotte, North Carolina, Danita was known for her intelligence, kindness, and determination. After graduating from West Charlotte High School in 2000, she went on to earn her bachelor's degree in English from North Carolina Central University in Durham. Danita was a bright, driven young woman, deeply devoted to her family, her faith, and her goals. She regularly attended University Park Baptist Church and was passionate about her future career. She returned to NCCU as a full-time graduate student, working towards her master's degree while serving as a photojournalist for the campus newspaper. In her personal life, Danita seemed just as grounded. She was newly engaged to Jameer Stroud, a Greensboro police officer whom she often described as the perfect man. To friends and family, it looked like she had everything lined up: a promising career, a loving fiancé, and strong family support. What Danita didn't realize was that her relationship had hidden complications. Before proposing to Danita, Dermier had been romantically involved with a woman named Shannon Crawley, a 911 dispatcher who lived in Greensboro. The relationship between Dermier and Shannon had ended, but Shannon struggled to move on. She was fully aware of Dermier's engagement and couldn't seem to let go of the past. Things reportedly took a turn when Shannon saw Dermier and Danita together at church, holding hands. This moment appeared to have fueled Shannon's growing jealousy. On January 4, 2007, around 8:10 a.m., a maintenance worker at Danita's apartment complex, Campus Crossings, heard a gunshot. Shortly after, he noticed a woman running away from the building and driving off in a burgundy Ford Explorer, visibly upset. At first, there was confusion, with some thinking there may have been an accident. It wasn't until later that morning, around 10 a.m., that another resident discovered Danita at the bottom of the apartment stairwell, her belongings scattered around her. What initially looked like a possible fall was soon revealed to be something far more sinister. Danita had been fatally shot. As police began their investigation, they quickly learned about Danita's connection to Jameer Stroud. and soon after about Jermier's past relationship with Shannon Crawley. Plus, the burgundy Ford Explorer that was spotted leaving the scene was found to be registered to Shannon. When detectives brought her in for questioning, they immediately noticed inconsistencies in her story. She claimed she'd been late to work that morning because she was taking her child to a doctor's appointment, but the pediatrician's office confirmed she never showed up. Cell phone records placed Shannon in Durham both the day before and the day of the incident, suggesting she had been in the area more than once. A search of her home turned up uniforms matching the description given by the maintenance worker. And investigators also found out she'd purchased a .38 revolver just a few months earlier, the same caliber as the weapon used. 5 days after Danita's death, Shannon was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. She pleaded not guilty, insisting that Jermier was the real culprit. She claimed he forced her to drive him to Durham and threatened her and her children. She even accused him of later attacking her. But investigators uncovered no credible evidence to support her story, with her phone records, witness testimony, and physical evidence contradicted her claims. In the end, she was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In June 1985, the quiet town of Greyhawk, Kentucky was shaken by a tragedy that would forever alter the lives of the Morris family. Edwin and Bessie Morris, ages 65 and 69, two beloved pillars of their community, were brutally murdered in their own home. The shocking details of their deaths, which included being tied up, beaten, and shot in cold blood, sent ripples of horror through the peaceful town, as the case marked the first double homicide in Jackson County's history. Edwin and Bessie, known for their kindness and community spirit, had built their lives running a grocery store, post office, and gas station. They were a lifeline to many, often helping those in need and hiding cash and styrofoam cups in their freezer to avoid theft. On June 16, 1985, the killers gained access to the Morrises' home, claiming they had run out of gas. This deceitful plea was met with the kindness of Edwin and Bessie, who invited the strangers in. But what followed was unspeakable violence. Once inside, the suspects gagged Edwin and tied his hands behind his back. He was later found dead on the kitchen floor. Bessie, on the other hand, was found on a bed in the bedroom with her hands and feet tied together behind her back. Edwin had been shot twice in the head, while Bessie was shot twice in the back. Ballistics determined that the murder weapons were a .38 caliber gun and a .357. They also found 9mm Luger bullets. It appears the killers used pillows to try and muffle the sound of the gunshots. Missing from the home was a diamond cluster ring, a set of diamond earrings, and a .38 caliber handgun. The crime was eventually traced back to Benny Lee Hodge, Donald Bartley, and Roger Epperson. The three men had gone to the Morris home with the purpose of robbing them. Once inside, the men knocked Edwin to the kitchen floor. Bartley, who was still outside, said he heard gunshots at that point. Once the men returned, they had a sack full of money estimated to contain $35,000. They also stole the ring, earrings, and a .38 caliber handgun. That gun, along with the two murder weapons, was tossed in the river at the bridge that goes into the Daniel Boone National Forest. After that, they burned Hodge's shirt and shoes. Hodge's wife, Sherry Hamilton, later said that he admitted to the murder following a scuffle with Edwin. He said it was he and Bartley and not Epperson who committed the murder. Once Edwin was dead, Bartley allegedly took Bessie in the bedroom and fatally shot her. Hodge also shot Bessie to ensure she was dead. After the crime, Sherry was given the ring and earrings that was stolen from the Morrises' home. In a chilling turn of events, one of the perpetrators was revealed to be the son of Edwin's best friend. Before the men were arrested, they also murdered Tammy D. Acker. On August 8, 1985, between 9 and 10 p.m., the men broke into the Acker home where she and her father, Dr. Roscoe J. Acker, were. Once inside, they forced Dr. Acker to open his safe, allowing the men to steal several $1,000s. Tammy was then fatally stabbed, while Dr. Acker was choked until he passed out. He woke up 40 minutes later, escaped from his bonds, and sadly found Tammy dead with a knife in her back. Thankfully, Dr. Acker survived the attack. After murdering Tammy, the men were quickly located, arrested, and charged with the murders. In the end, both Roger Epperson and Benny Hodge was convicted and sentenced to death. Donald Bartley was also convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Epperson and Hodge were tried 3 times and were sentenced to death each time. Harold Allen, who went by Herb, was born on September 29, 1970 in Scottsburg, Indiana. He grew up in a close-knit family and had a strong work ethic and a love for his career at Ishin, USA. He was married to Marcia Allen, who, on the surface, seemed to share a normal, happy life with him. However, the tragic events that unfolded later revealed a different story. On December 20, 2022, 52-year-old Harold was found unconscious in the home he shared with Marcia in Freetown, Indiana. Initial reports indicated that he had passed away from natural causes. However, the circumstances surrounding his death soon sparked suspicion, prompting a deeper investigation that would uncover a chilling plot. It wasn't until the following year, 2023, that the truth began to emerge. On September 19, 2023, Marcia reported a burglary at their home. 2 men, Stephen White and Nathaniel Napier, had stolen firearms and jewelry. During questioning, one of the burglars revealed a startling piece of information. Ashley Jones, Marcia's daughter, had confided in him that her mother had murdered her husband by poisoning him. This confession triggered an investigation into Harold's death. As police dug deeper, they uncovered a string of incriminating text messages between Marcia and Ashley that painted a sinister picture. The two had been plotting Harold's murder for months, and the details were shockingly elaborate. In late November 2022, Marcia texted Ashley asking her to procure foxglove seeds, a toxic plant. However, Ashley warned her that the seeds were traceable. In the same text thread, they discussed using ethylene glycol, a deadly substance commonly found in antifreeze, as a means to poison Harold. On December 13, 2022, Marcia ordered a gallon of ethylene glycol for $31.99, and the 2 women planned to use it in a root beer float, a drink Harold loved. Just days later, on December 19th, Ashley texted her mother, excitedly reporting that the substance had arrived. Marcia responded with enthusiasm, sending a heart emoji, indicating how eager they were to proceed with the plan. The following day, Marcia prepared the root beer float, spiking it with the ethylene glycol. According to the affidavit, Harold began acting drunk and loopy shortly after consuming the drink. Marcia then waited 5 hours before calling 911. Ashley had even bragged about how she would be able to access his hidden accounts after his death. However, police would never be able to arrest Marcia because she took her own life on October 16, 2023. Just 1 day before her death, Marcia had been questioned by police. Ashley was also interviewed and admitted to ordering the poison, but claimed her mother was the one who had actually administered it. However, investigators had enough on her as well. They had discovered an exchange that took place in November 2022, when Ashley texted her mother about the big plan and expressed her impatience with the slow pace of their efforts. Marcia responded with frustration, saying, "I need this to be over. I wish it would reach its climax and be done, It was clear that they were both eagerly awaiting the moment when their plan would come to fruition. 2 days after her mother took her own life, Ashley was arrested and charged with multiple offenses, including 2 counts of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and consumer product tampering. Further investigation revealed that Ashley had been involved in another suspicious death, the death of her husband, Tierson Jones, in 2019. Tierson was found dead just days after receiving an inheritance from his great-grandfather. Ashley's actions surrounding his death raised red flags, as she had quickly cremated his body before his family could request an autopsy. She claimed Tierson had died from alcohol poisoning, but his family remained suspicious. At the time, Tierson's uncle, William White, spoke out, saying that Ashley had prevented the family from investigating his death, and had even hurriedly arranged the cremation. Law enforcement has stated they are aware of the claims surrounding Tierson's death, but no investigation has been formally opened. Currently, Ashley's trial date is set for August 4, 2025, and while the focus remains on Harold's murder, her husband's death remains open. Early 2022, 26-year-old Thomas Pearson III lived in Evesham Township, New Jersey, where he was an aspiring writer and solar energy salesman. Thomas was originally from Medford Lakes, New Jersey, and was known for his kindness. He was a self-published author on the topic of New Jersey's solar industry and was an active social media figure who shared his thoughts and perspectives on a range of topics. In 2020, he adopted a dog he named Django and proudly introduced him as his guard dog. The two had an unbreakable bond until a horrible tragedy occurred. On the morning of February 5, 2022, police responded to a call shortly after 9 a.m. regarding a possible dog bite. However, what they discovered was far more sinister. On the stairwell landing of the apartment complex lay Thomas in a pool of blood near his dog, who was also dead. Investigators quickly pieced together the horrifying details, including a 911 call from an upstairs neighbor who had heard commotion just before the attack. That's also how they identified the suspect as 27-year-old Donovan G. Hollingsworth, who was friends with Thomas. Apparently, Hollingsworth had been struggling financially when he went to Thomas's apartment to rob him. At that point, Hollingsworth began viciously attacking Pearson, stabbing him repeatedly. Django, Pearson's loyal guard dog, rushed to defend his owner but was fatally stabbed in the process. Authorities eventually located Hollingsworth at a nearby hospital after he sought medical help for minor injuries. Investigators also discovered a phone call he had made with his father where he confessed to the murder. However, he claimed that a confrontation over marijuana escalated into a violent struggle with Pearson allegedly attacking him. He also told his father that the dog bit him in the process. Regardless of his claim, in August 2023, he was convicted of first-degree murder, first-degree robbery, cruelty to animals, and other charges. The judge sentenced him to 34 years in state prison, 30 of which were for the murder, with no possibility of parole, and an additional 4 years for the killing of Django. Christine Schultz was born on November 15, 1950. At age 30, she was a mother of 2 living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where she was trying to make a fresh start after a difficult divorce from her first husband, Alfred Schultz, a Milwaukee police detective who went by Fred. Christine had custody of their 2 sons and was now dating a man named Stuart Honeck. Unfortunately, she would never get to enjoy her new life, because in the spring of 1981, a horrible tragedy occurred. On May 27, 1981, Christine had spent the evening with Stuart before returning home to her sons. Around 2 a.m., an intruder entered her home, bound her hands, gagged her with a bandana, and shot her in the back with a .38 caliber revolver. Her 2 sons, Sean and Shannon, sadly witnessed the aftermath. Sean later recalled hearing a loud noise like a firecracker and saw a masked man fleeing the house. At first glance, there appeared to be no obvious motive. No valuables were stolen, and there was no sign of forced entry, suggesting a crime of passion or something intended to silence Christine. However, the details of her murder would set off a series of events that would lead to accusations, trials, and a media sensation. Sean's description of the intruder as a tall man with reddish-brown hair tied in a ponytail did not immediately provide any clear leads. But the investigation took a dramatic turn when the focus shifted to her ex-husband's second wife, Lori Benbenick, who went by Bambi. Bambi was a former police officer and ex-Playboy bunny, whose name would become synonymous with the case. Bambi had this to say: "I worked as a waitress at the Playboy Club for just 3 weeks, but it seemed like I'd always be remembered as the Playboy bunny." This brief stint would become a defining part of her public narrative, one the media eagerly clung to. In March 1980, she joined the Milwaukee police force, eager to prove herself in a male-dominated field. However, after only a few months, Bambi was dismissed during her probationary period and filed a sex discrimination complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, alleging her dismissal was rooted in gender bias rather than performance issues. After leaving the police department, Bambi's life took another dramatic turn when she became involved with Fred. Their relationship escalated quickly, and within 3 months of Fred's divorce from Christine, he married Bambi on January 29, 1981. Their whirlwind relationship would soon lead to a scandal and tragedy. As the investigation into Christine's murder progressed, Bambi's connection to the crime became more apparent. She had reportedly expressed jealousy over the financial support Fred was still providing Christine, including alimony payments. They also located witnesses who said Bambi had talked about blowing Christine's head off and had even approached people about hiring someone to kill her. The breakthrough in the investigation came when a reddish-brown wig was found clogging the plumbing of the apartment building where Bambi lived. Fibers from the wig were found to match those discovered at the crime scene. Further forensic analysis linked Bambi's hair to that found on Christine's gag. The final piece of evidence came when Fred's off-duty revolver was found to be the murder weapon. Bambi had access to the gun and the ballistics matched the fatal shot. In late June 1981, Bambi was arrested. The investigation also revealed troubling details about Fred's alibi. While he had claimed to be on duty the night of the murder, he later admitted to lying about his whereabouts, revealing he had been drinking at a bar with a fellow officer. Despite Fred's lies, he was cleared of direct involvement, and all evidence pointed toward Bambi as the killer. On March 9, 1982, after a 3-week trial, Bambi was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Her case became a media sensation, with Bambi becoming a controversial figure. Many believed she was wrongfully convicted and rallied behind her. T-shirts emblazoned with "Run Bambi Run" were sold, and a Bambi look-alike contest was held in her honor. In 1990, Bambi escaped from Tachita Correctional Institution with the help of her fiancé, Dominique Gugliotto. The two fled to Canada where they spent 3 months on the run before being captured in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Supporters continued to rally for her, convinced she had been the victim of a miscarriage of justice. After her capture and extradition, Bambi was granted a judicial review, which revealed significant mistakes in the original investigation. While no conspiracy was proven, the errors in handling evidence were enough to warrant a new trial. Rather than face the possibility of a second conviction, Bambi pled no contest to second-degree murder in 1992. She was released after serving just over 10 years in prison. Despite her release, Bambi continued to maintain her innocence. In 2002, after completing her parole, she filed a motion seeking DNA testing to clear her name. In the midst of this legal battle, she was severely injured while attempting to escape during a Dr. Phil show appearance. The fall resulted in the amputation of her right foot. Bambi's case continued to make headlines with her attorney pushing for a pardon. Despite her efforts, Bambi's request for posthumous pardons remained unanswered. Her legal fight to clear her name was fueled by new DNA evidence, but no conclusive match has yet been made. Bambi died on November 20, 2010 in hospice care after battling liver and kidney failure, a complication of hepatitis C. Her death did little to quiet the controversy surrounding her case, with many still believing she was wrongfully convicted. To this day, her story remains one of the most discussed and debated in Wisconsin's criminal history. Christine Schultz's murder was ultimately solved with the conviction of Bambi, but questions about the investigation, Bambi's role, and the involvement of others still linger. As the case continues to unfold, some wonder if there's more to the story than what has been revealed. Was Bambi framed? And if she wasn't the killer, then who was? Here are reasons people believe she is innocent. They believe the evidence was weak considering it was only the wig and Christine's hair on a pair of her pants. Some believe she was framed for her accusations of gender discrimination while on the Milwaukee force. Some believe she wasn't really that jealous of Christine. There were also allegedly conflicting witness testimonies, and some even recanted or later altered their stories. Some have also criticized the defense team for not aggressively challenging the prosecution's evidence. It was also said that some jurors were shifted because of her prior work as a waitress at a Playboy club. Some point to the polygraph she passed, while others point to the individuals who reportedly confessed or implicated themselves in the crime but were never formally charged. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Andrea Michelle Bowman was born Alexis Miranda Badger on June 23, 1974 in New Orleans, Louisiana. Her teenage mother was promised by Catholic Charities that her baby would be well cared for by a good family. She was placed in foster care at 5 months old with Dennis and Brenda Bowman of Virginia and would be adopted by them at 21 months old. They would eventually relocate to Michigan. When Andrea was 6 years old, Bowman went to prison for 5 years for intent to perform criminal sexual assault when he attempted to lure and assault a woman in a wooded area in western Michigan. The 18-year-old woman was riding her bicycle when Bowman approached on a motorcycle and tried to force her to walk into the woods. She was able to escape when someone in a truck pulled up to help. He was also the suspect in abducting a 6-year-old girl, and his wife supported him through it all. He also had a criminal record even before adopting Andrea, which disallowed him from being able to join the Navy, but was somehow able to adopt a child. In 1988, at age 14, Andrea told her guidance counselor at her high school that she was fearful of going home. The school involved law enforcement who interviewed her, and she told them Bowman often molested her. However, a social worker returned Andrea to her home and confronted her parents about the allegations. And of course, they refused the allegations, claiming that she was just being rebellious after finding out that she was adopted. Shortly after the allegations were made, the family would move to a very rural area in Hamilton, Michigan. On March 11, 1989, Bowman reported Andrea missing, claiming that he came home from work and noticed that she had stolen $100 from the home before running away. His wife Brenda later increased the amount that was missing to $150. That was enough for police to issue a warrant for Andrea's arrest for larceny, and the warrant listed Dennis as the victim of his daughter's alleged crime. With no foul play suspected, the police quickly classified her as a runaway and passed her case along to the Youth Services Bureau. For the next several months, her adoptive mother made several calls to police in which she stated she had been told of numerous sightings of Andrea, leading to the belief that she was a runaway, though these sightings could not be substantiated. Sadly, Andrea would be dismissed as a runaway for the next 30 years. In 1993, just like Thomas Dean Gibson from my 5 Cold Cases in Oregon video, she was one of several missing children whose photographs were shown in the music video for the Soul Asylum song Runaway Train. In 1998, 10 years after she went missing, Bowman was arrested for breaking and entering the home of a coworker to steal items, including her lingerie. Before his sentencing in the case, he referenced his missing daughter in a letter to the presiding judge saying, "I am the father of 2 lovely daughters, one 25 and the other 11, and feel that being a parent is one of the most important and sobering things a person can undertake." In November 2019, Dennis Bowman was arrested for the 1980 murder of Kathleen Dull in Norfolk, Virginia. He was extradited back to Virginia in February 2020 to face charges in Dull's murder after DNA linked him to her sexual assault and murder 30 years earlier. In May 2020, he was also charged with Andrea's murder. Prior to his arrest in 2019, the Bowmans went to police to complain that Andrea's biological mother was harassing them and accusing him of her murder. Police took the water bottle that he left at the police station and tested it for DNA. That is how he was linked to Kathleen Dull's murder. Once arrested, he also confessed to other crimes. It wasn't until 2019, after he was arrested in the Virginia cold case, that Brenda supposedly learned what really happened to Andrea. During recorded phone conversations from jail, Bowman described to his wife that he killed Andrea. Several days later, it was announced that skeletal remains had been recovered on 136th Avenue in Hamilton, Michigan, concealed by a thin layer of cement. In order to determine if the victim was indeed Andrea, they tracked down her birth mother, Kathy, who in turn provided her DNA, proving the remains indeed belonged to Andrea, or Alexis as her mother had named her. In February 2021, Bowman's wife testified at a preliminary hearing that her husband confessed to her that he murdered Andrea more than 31 years ago. He stated that he came home on March 11, 1989 to find Andrea had packed a bag and was threatening to tell someone he was molesting her again. He said he slapped her and she fell down the stairs, and so he hid her in a barn before he decided to report her missing. Later, he buried her in the backyard. He said he then reburied her after moving from 4249 Lincoln Road in Holland, Michigan to Hamilton, Michigan as soon as they signed papers on the land. Brenda Bowman testified that Andrea told her one morning that her dad had molested her, and Brenda said she told her she was a liar. Bowman is serving 2 life sentences in a Virginia prison after pleading guilty to raping and killing 25-year-old Kathleen Dole in 1980. In November 2021, Bowman decided to plead not guilty to Andrea's murder, and the trial will apparently carry over into 2022. Shockingly, years after Andrea's disappearance, he taught Sunday school to kindergartners at church as a sex offender. It is speculated that he committed many other sexual assaults and even murders. As of today, Andrea thankfully has her name back and her alleged killer is behind bars. At age 41, Stephen Edenfield was a private man who worked for the phone company and kept much of his personal life to himself. He lived in Tampa, Florida, in a condo at the Racket Club complex, just minutes away from his mother, brother, and sister. Though he was close to his family, he rarely shared details about his personal life because this was the 90s and homosexuality wasn't as widely accepted. On the evening of January 31st, 1997, Stephen had dinner with his brother and sister before heading out for drinks. He left alone and later returned to his condo just before 1 a.m. As he approached the gated entrance, he realized he had forgotten his remote he needed to enter, but the security guard was nice enough to let him in. He also allowed the car behind Stephen to enter at Stephen's request. Unfortunately, the guard didn't get a good look at the driver of the second vehicle. Shortly after Stephen entered his apartment, neighbors reported hearing a disturbance, furniture breaking, yelling, and cries for help. By 2 a.m., the security guard conducting his routine rounds noticed a shadowy figure lurking near Stephen's apartment. The figure quickly disappeared, and the guard didn't think much of it at the time. The next morning, Stephen failed to show up to his mother's place to take over for his brother James, who was caring for their mother. This was unlike Stephen, and a concerned James began trying to call him, but there was no answer. By 10 a.m., James decided to go check on him. When he pulled into the complex, he noticed Stephen's car was still parked in its usual spot. He climbed the stairs to his brother's condo and found the door unlocked. Inside, he was met with a horrifying scene. The apartment was in disarray, furniture overturned and items broken. In the dimly lit bedroom, Stephen lay in bed, unresponsive. Blood stained the walls and sheets, and scrawled across the bedroom wall, written in Stephen's own blood, was the word greed. Shaken, James ran out to the superintendent's office, barely able to speak, and had them call 911. The brutal nature of the crime suggested a deeply personal attack, yet with no signs of forced entry and few immediate leads, the case quickly went cold. Decades later, in 2022, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit revisited the case utilizing advanced forensic DNA testing conducted by Othram Labs. This renewed effort was funded by a Bureau of Justice Assistance grant and involved forensic genetic genealogy analysis. In 2024, investigators identified an unknown DNA profile that not only linked to Stephen's murder, but also to an unsolved 2005 sexual assault case in Illinois. The breakthrough led authorities to Brandon Gliha, a 47-year-old man living in Tampa, Florida. Gliha had recently been arrested on an unrelated forgery warrant out of Illinois in February 2025. While in custody, investigators obtained a DNA sample which matched evidence from the 1997 crime scene. Confronted with the evidence, Gliha confessed to his involvement in Stephen's murder. Gliha claimed that a man known only as Chino had picked him up that night and the two went to Stephen's condo. He alleged that Chino intended for him to engage in a sexual act with Stephen, which left him feeling violated and angry. According to Gliha, an argument ensued between Chino and Stephen over money, leading Gliha to throw a porcelain statue at Stephen. A struggle followed and Gliha stated that Chino ultimately stabbed Stephen to death. Despite his claims of limited involvement, authorities have not indicated if they're searching for the man known only as Chino. Regardless, on February 24, 2025, Gliha was officially charged with first-degree murder with a weapon and robbery with a deadly weapon. He remains in custody without bond. Stephen's brother, James, who had discovered the horrifying scene nearly 3 decades earlier, lived to see justice served. However, their mother and sister, both of whom had shared Stephen's final evening, passed away before Gliha's arrest. James revealed that their mother had suffered multiple heart attacks and a stroke, believing that the weight of Stephen's unsolved murder had contributed to her declining health. After 28 years, the brutal murder of Stephen Edenfield has finally been solved, offering a long-awaited sense of closure for those who loved him. However, lingering questions remain about the full circumstances of that fateful night and whether others were involved in the crime. Martika Ferguson, known as Tyka, was born on May 20, 1993 in Colorado Springs, Colorado to Leela Edwards and Gothy Barksdale. She was then adopted by David and Effie Ferguson in 1999. At age 27, she lived in Enid, Oklahoma, and was the mother of a young son, Devontae. Described as having a joyful personality and a brilliant smile, Martika loved to sing and dance and found solace in music. She was a former high school cheerleader and was known for her artistic spirit, vibrant personality, and deep devotion to her child. However, her promising life was tragically cut short when she was shot and left for dead in an alley. An autopsy later confirmed that the weapon used was a shotgun. Investigators quickly identified a suspect after analyzing surveillance footage from nearby businesses and residences. The suspect was 30-year-old Shanedale Perosi, a convicted felon with a criminal history, including a child abuse conviction in 2010 and an assault on an officer charged in 2016. Notably, Perosi's residence was just a block away from where Tyka's body was found. On December 2, 2020, SWAT officers executed a no-knock warrant at Perosi's home, arresting him on charges of first-degree murder, destruction of evidence, and possession of a firearm after a felony conviction. Surveillance footage played a crucial role in the investigation, capturing Tyka walking alone before encountering a biker wearing a black jacket and a cowboy hat. Later identified as Perosi, the two were seen walking toward Hallmark Baptist Church and then into an alley where they moved out of the camera's view. 12 minutes later, Perosi was seen alone, leaving the scene on his motorcycle. Investigators received an anonymous tip that helped identify Perosi. The tipster revealed that he and Tyka had dated in the past and she occasionally stayed at his residence, which was set up in a garage. The tipster also stated that Perosi had sent threatening messages, including one that ominously mentioned, "You might end up like your girl Tyka. I hear they found her dead yesterday." Upon searching Perosi's home, authorities found evidence linking him to the crime, including the distinctive jacket seen in the surveillance footage. When confronted with the evidence, Perosi confessed to killing Martika. His statements to investigators were chilling. He said he was glad he killed her and did it to teach her a lesson. He further expressed frustration with people he referred to as tweakers, whom he accused of stealing from him. Perosi alleged that a friend had caught Martika inside his home the day before her death, leading him to ban her from his residence. He stated that she was only permitted to be near the church, but not his house. Despite his admission of guilt, Perosi attempted to shift partial blame on Martika, claiming that she had grabbed the gun after he cocked it and that it accidentally discharged. Nonetheless, his statements and actions made it clear that the killing was intentional. In the end, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Mary McLaughlin was a mother of 11, described as friendly, trusting, and a happy-go-lucky person. On September 26, 1984, the 58-year-old grandmother spent the evening playing dominoes and having drinks in the Henlyn pub, now called the Duck Club, in Glasgow, United Kingdom, in an area known as Glasgow's West End. Her daughter, Catherine, had to leave the pub early to catch a bus home and didn't know this was the last time she would see her mother alive. Mary was seen leaving the pub at 10:45 p.m. to walk less than a mile home to her flat in Partwick, where she lived alone. On the way, she made a stop at the Armando's Chip Shop on Dumbarton Road, where she bought cigarettes and fritters and appeared in a happy mood. A local taxi driver who knew Mary as we may stated that she walked in front of his taxi carrying her shoes and her hands and a man following behind her. This man, believed to be Graham McGill, struck up a conversation with Mary and walked her back to her Crothy Court block on Laurel Street. Mary's daughter reported that sometimes her mother would invite people back to her flat when she had been drinking. Days earlier, McGill had been granted a weekend release from prison. He had been convicted of rape in 1981 and was in his final weeks of a 6-year sentence, which had been cut in half due to good behavior. He allegedly killed Mary that night and using her keys, which have never been recovered, to lock the door behind him and then return to prison the next day. 5 days after her death, her son Martin and his then-girlfriend, June Brittle, showed up to her flat for a visit and was shocked by a horrible smell. He kicked the door in and June, who has since passed away, entered the flat and discovered the crime scene and came out screaming. Mary's cause of death was strangulation, but with little information beyond this, the case would go cold. Over the years, there were several attempts at developing a profile of the suspect that were unsuccessful. Then in 2019, experts decided to untie a knot in the ligature and examine the area of the knot that had been protected from contamination all those years. That's when they were able to develop a DNA profile that did not belong to Mary. When the profile was run through the Scottish database, police finally had a suspect, Graham McGill. His DNA profile was also found on a cigarette butt, on Mary's dress, and on a bra that he took from the flat, which was later found in a nearby garden. After McGill's conviction, he was also jailed for life in 1999 for a brutal assault with intent to ravish, but released on parole in 2007. On December 4, 2019, 59-year-old sex offender McGill was arrested at his home for Mary's murder. During the investigation, his ex-wife said that in 1988, he confessed to killing a woman he met in a pub after going back to her flat and then threatened to kill her if she ever told anyone. Although he got to live free for 35 years, he was ordered to be imprisoned for at least 14 years. One of her daughters, Gina, wrote a book about her mother to keep her memory alive, titled Diamonds and Pearls. It is named after a lyric in her late mother's favorite song, Little Things Mean a Lot by Kitty Collin. Mary's family waited a long time for justice, and hopefully McGill's arrest will provide them some form of resolution. Pauline Brassett was born on September 1, 1959 of Metis descent. Although she was Metis, she and her family did not grow up within First Nations culture. At 16, Pauline was a young mother from Saskatchewan who had recently relocated to Calgary, Alberta, Canada in the fall of 1975 with her infant daughter and older sister. On January 8, 1976, Pauline spent the evening at her aunt's house partying with friends. Around 2:30 a.m., she and another person decided to go eat pizza at Pepe's restaurant located at 7th Street and 17th Avenue in Calgary. After finishing their meal, they left together, but Pauline soon realized she had forgotten her gloves. She returned to the restaurant alone, heavily intoxicated, to retrieve them. Unable to find them, she left and began walking back to her aunt's house. Sadly, she would never arrive. Approximately 5 hours later, on January 9, 1976, Pauline's partially clothed body was found on Jumping Pond Forestry Road, a remote area located about 22 miles southwest of Cochrane, Alberta. She had been stabbed to death, and an autopsy confirmed the manner of death was homicide. Pauline's murder was among a series of unsolved cases in the Calgary area during the 1970s and early 1980s. Authorities suspected that her case was linked to the so-called highway murders, a series of killings in which young women were sexually assaulted and left in remote locations along the Trans-Canada Highway. However, despite extensive investigations, no suspect was identified at the time and the case eventually went cold. In 1995, a task force was formed to investigate historical homicides, including Pauline's case, but it remained unsolved. In 2021, the Alberta Royal Canadian Mounted Police Historical Homicide Unit partnered with the Calgary Police Service Cold Case Homicide Unit to reanalyze unsolved murders from the 1970s, leveraging new advancements in forensic technology. In 2022, investigators turned to Othram, whose scientists developed a comprehensive DNA profile for the unknown suspect. That profile was then analyzed by forensic genealogists from Convergence Investigative Genetic Genealogy. By 2023, investigators had identified a suspect, 73-year-old Ronald James Edwards of Sundre, Alberta. Unfortunately, no photo of Edwards was released. On November 7, 2023, he was arrested and charged with 9 capital murder, the classification used in the criminal code at the time of Pauline's death. Authorities revealed that Edwards had a violent criminal history. In 1989, he was convicted in Calgary of attempted murder and sexual assault and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He later attempted to appeal his conviction but was unsuccessful. In the end, Edwards admitted to killing Pauline and pleaded guilty to a charge of manslaughter. He was then sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. At the age of 31, Catherine Donahue lived in Arlington, Virginia, where she worked as a secretary. She was known for her warmth and hardworking nature and had her whole life ahead of her before she encountered a very evil individual. Unfortunately, there isn't much public information available about her personal life, including whether she ever married or had children. Regardless, on March 3, 1979, Catherine's body was discovered by someone walking through a parking lot in the 8400 block of Hamlin Street in Glen Arden, Virginia. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. Law enforcement quickly responded, launching an investigation that included collecting forensic evidence, interviewing potential witnesses, and following numerous leads. However, despite their efforts, the case quickly grew cold. The forensic technology of the time, particularly DNA testing, was not advanced enough to provide meaningful evidence or identify a suspect. As the years passed, the case grew colder and Catherine's family was left to cope with the tragedy of not knowing who murdered their loved one. That is until 2024, when the Prince George's County Police Department's Cold Case Unit decided to revisit the case with modern forensic advancements. Evidence from the crime scene was sent to Othram and a comprehensive genetic profile was created. This profile was then submitted to the FBI's Forensic Genetic Genealogy team, who worked tirelessly to track down potential relatives of the suspect. Their hard work paid off when they identified Roger Zotis Brown, now in his 80s, as a person of interest. While Brown was never considered a suspect during the original investigation, he did live in the area about 15 miles from Arlington. A DNA sample was then obtained from Brown and confirmed the match, conclusively linking him to Catherine's murder. Brown has been charged with first-degree murder and sexual assault. Plus, investigators are now looking into whether he may be connected to any other unsolved crimes from that time period. As of now, he remains in jail, awaiting the outcome of the case.